Boston, 1906. The air was thick with coal, smoke, and salt. The streets still slick from a morning rain that refused to dry. Gas lamps burned like weary sentinels along the narrow lanes, their glow fractured by the fog that rolled in from the harbor. The city hummed with its usual unrest horses stamping against cobblestones, voices echoing from taverns, and beneath it all, the low groan of a town built on debt. On one of those crooked streets stood a boarding house that leaned ever so slightly forward, as though listening to its own past. Inside, behind warped glass and drawn curtains, lived a man named Hargrove. The tenants called him Mr. H. In whispers, as if speaking his name too clearly might raise their rent. His office smelled of ink and mold. The wallpaper, once ivory, had yellowed to the color of old teeth. On his desk sat a walnut cabinet with brass corners, where he kept his ledgers, his only companions worth trusting. Every entry was written in perfect script, names, dates, amounts owed. It wasn't business to him. It was control. Hargrove believed a person's worth could be measured in how promptly they paid him. He never married, never smiled for anything without a coin's edge to it. He had grown rich off the weak and bitter off the rich. The tenants feared the sound of his boots on the stairwell. He would walk through the hall like a judge approaching the gallows, ledger in hand, candle in the other, as if light itself owed him rent. There was always someone falling behind. The seamstress with her blind son, the sailor's widow who prayed too loudly, the maid who paid half with coins and half with silence. To him, pity was wasted currency. One evening, during his monthly inspection, he came upon the widow's room, the one who kept to herself and spoke to no one after dusk. The door creaked open, and there she was, sitting by her window with a single candle burning beside her. Its light trembled against the cracked mirror, giving the illusion that another face flickered beside hers. Hargrove scoffed. "You waste wax for nothing, madam. You'll have no light left to read your eviction notice." She didn't move. Her eyes were steady, her voice calm. "This candle burns for him," she said, "and it will not go out until my time is done." He laughed, a sharp, unkind sound that echoed off the damp walls. "Then let the dead pay their rent," he said. He slammed the door and left her in darkness, though the flame, faint as it was, still glowed through the cracks beneath her door. That night, the wind pressed against the windows. The house creaked like an old confession. Somewhere upstairs, the widow coughed once, and then went quiet. By morning, her room was empty. The candle was gone. She had passed in her sleep, or perhaps something gentler than sleep had taken her. Hargrove ordered her belongings cleared and the room locked. He claimed the last month's rent from her deposit and added another neat line to his ledger. Vacated deceased. But by the third evening after her burial, something strange began. A faint glow appeared in Hargrove's own window long after the lamps were out. The caretaker, an old man with rheumy eyes, noticed it first. He swore he saw a single candle burning on Hargrove's desk steady, upright, though no one had entered that locked study. He mentioned it to the tenants. They murmured, crossing themselves, remembering the widow's words. Hargrove brushed it off. "Superstition is for the poor," he said. Yet that night, when he tried to write his accounts, his pen faltered. The ink ran too thick. The candle he'd lit guttered, and flared with a hiss, as if exhaling. The room grew colder. He thought it was the draught. He pressed the flame between his fingers and snuffed it out. Darkness. Only the sound of the rain tapping the window pane remained. But as he turned, another light flickered from the far corner of the room, soft amber, unfamiliar. It wasn't his candle. It stood by the cabinet where he kept his ledgers, steady and bright. He stepped closer. The air thickened, smelled faintly of tallow and something older, something like old wax melted too many times. His heart thudded. The candle didn't flicker. It breathed. He blinked, and the light vanished. In its place lay a smear of wax across the cabinet's brass handle, as though a hand had rested there moments before. Hargrove's laughter came thin and nervous. "Nonsense," he muttered, locking the drawer tighter. But that night, he couldn't sleep at precisely midnight. Footsteps echoed across the corridor, outside his door, slow, deliberate, measured. He listened, breath held. They stopped right outside. The air pressed heavy against the keyhole. Then came the faintest sound, a breath or a whisper. "Paid." Just one word, faint as smoke. He threw open the door. The hall was empty, the gaslights flickering. Downstairs, the caretaker stirred from his cot, thinking he'd heard someone pacing above him. But when he checked, there were no footprints in the dust. Only the smell of burned wax lingered. By morning, Hargrove's mood had curled. He barked at tenants, slammed doors, ordered new locks. He told himself it was stress, that the widow's talk of eternal candles had infected the house with foolish imagination. But something in him had shifted. He caught himself glancing at windows, expecting to see that faint light reflected back. Days passed, and the whispers spread. Children avoided the steps after dusk. Tenants said the sound of dripping wax came from Hargrove's study, even when no candles burned. The caretaker swore he saw a figure at the window, a silhouette too still to be alive. "She's come to collect," someone whispered, "for all the debts he never paid." Hargrove stopped laughing. He took to writing by daylight only, sealing his door each night with a strip of paper as though guarding himself from something unseen. But every morning the seal was broken, the edges singed. Once he found a thin trail of wax leading from the desk to the door, curling like handwriting across the floorboards. He scrubbed it away until the wood showed raw. Still, it returned. He began to drink. Cheap whiskey filled the empty hours between fear and sleep. His hands shook when he lit matches. The tenants barely saw him. When they did, his eyes were red, the pupils small and glassy, as if he'd been staring at fire too long. "You'll see," he said once to the caretaker. "It's just air and memory. Nothing more." But when the caretaker came by later that night, the landlord's window was glowing again. Not faintly this time. The light pulsed, alive, like a heartbeat. A week later, the house fell silent. Tenants moved out, one by one. The caretaker found the ledgers untouched but damp, the ink bleeding down the pages. Hargrove himself was gone, his boots by the bed, his chair overturned. On the desk sat a single candle, still burning, though it had melted halfway through its holder. No smoke, no draft, no trace of who had lit it. The flame leaned toward the window, steady and unwavering. It burned all through the night. By morning, when the caretaker dared to return, the wax had cooled into the shape of a handprint. The candle's wick was gone, but the air still shimmered faintly, as though holding the echo of light. From that day forward, those who passed the house said they could see a glow through the curtains at midnight, a soft, golden pulse that never dimmed. They said it was the landlord's pride turned to penance, the widow's candle finding its way home. No one ever entered that room again. The cabinet stayed locked. The ledgers were left unopened, pages sealed by wax and time. But the story lingered, whispered down alleys, traded across bar counters and sewing circles. Some said it was guilt. Others said it was justice. But those who'd lived there knew better. They said some debts burn longer than life allows. They said a candle that refuses to die does not light the living. It remembers the dead, and so the house grew darker, quieter, until only that one light remained, trembling softly against the window. No laughter, no footsteps, no more rent to collect. Just the faint hum of a city that had forgotten his name. But on some winter nights, when the wind moves through the harbor and the fog swallows the street, a passerby might still glimpse it, the flicker of a flame where no hand holds it, where no life remains to tend it. The last light of Mr. Hargrove's ledgered soul, burning slow against the weight of all he never paid. He built his days on other people's fear. That is the simplest way to say it, and the truest. Hargrove watched the seasons harden the city, and he hardened with them. When winter pressed its cold hand over Boston, and the harbor fog froze into lace along the eaves, he raised the rent. When the first sleet rattled the windows and smoke crawled from the chimneys like tired ghosts, he posted notices on doors written in tight, perfect script. Mothers folded them, tucked them into aprons, and cried in stairwells that smelled of cabbage and coal. Children learned to step lightly when his boots struck the steps. He did not look at faces. He looked at ledgers. He believed in ink. He believed in locks. He believed in money arriving at his desk the way the tide arrives at the wharf-cold clockwork without mercy. He did not believe in prayer. He did not believe in ghosts. Even pity has a price, he once said to the caretaker, though no one had asked him to speak of pity at all. After the widow was turned out and the room cleared, something changed. It was small at first, easy to deny. He came to the desk one morning and found his figures smudged into dark bruises, as if a wet thumb had pressed each number into silence. He blamed the ink. He blamed the damp. He copied the lines again, this time harder, carving the nib into the paper until the tip squealed. That night he sealed the ledger with a strip of paper and wax, his stamp pushed deep into the soft pool like a coin sinking in mud. He slept with the key under his pillow. In the morning, the seal was broken. The wax was cold. The stamp's impression had been smoothed, as if someone had pressed a warm palm over it long enough to erase his name. He checked the drawer. The pages were shuffled. A rent paid. A debt forgiven. A line struck through by a hand not his. He felt the hot rise of anger, and then beneath it, a colder thing. He told himself it was draft and vermin. He told himself stories about simple causes. But the house had found a new silence, and it lived in the corners. Servants whispered that the stairs creaked even when no one climbed them. The gas lamps along the corridor trembled when he walked past, a nervous shiver that made the shadows move like water. He told them to mind their work. He told them to close the vents. He told them to keep candles away from the old wood, even as the faint scent of tallow followed him from room to room like a patient stray. One tenant, a washerwoman with salt-burned hands, woke to find his shoes outside her door. They were damp with ash. No footprints led to them. She left them there until morning and would not touch them, as if the leather had learned something it ought not carry into her room. Hargrove scowled when he heard. He took the shoes back, polished them until they threw back his face in two bent, black reflections, and told himself that fear embroiders facts. He tested every lock. He tested the windows. He slept with matches on the table. He could not explain why his breath fogged in the room when the fire burned bright. He could not explain why the flame leaned toward the ledger at night, a slow bow, as if listening for a name. After dusk, the house cooled in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Even the caretaker, who had met every kind of winter, pulled his blanket tight and kept his hat on in the hall. "There's a draft near your study," he said once, and then, not meeting Hargrove's eyes, like a church door opening when it shouldn't. Hargrove laughed too loudly. "Let them haunt me," he said to the empty air, pretending an audience. "Even ghosts owe rent." His voice sounded thin, like a bell rung in fog. The servants avoided the landing outside his study. Light did not want to hold there. When they passed, their steps turned careful. They spoke with their chins tucked to their collars, as if speech could summon attention. A maid sent to dust the parlor came back pale and damp at the temples. The carpet, she said, had stiff swells of wax in it, pale ropes of it that ran under the desk and ended at the hearth, though no one had burned a candle there that day. Hargrove went himself. He found the drips long, deliberate, as though laid down by a patient hand. He scraped them with a knife, each curl falling to the floor like shavings from a bone. In the knife's reflection, he saw the candle on his desk behind him. It burned with a calm, clean flame. He had not lit it. He turned. The room felt narrower. The air had the weight of a closed book. He pinched the wick flat between his fingers until smoke stitched his skin, then cracked the window to let the fog chew the smell away. The smoke did not rise. It folded upon itself and slid toward the ledger drawer. He shut the window. He told himself to eat. He swallowed a piece of bread and tasted old tallow. He took to walking the halls at odd hours, as if he could pin the house to a single rhythm by the force of his pacing. He tried to meet the cold like a man meets an insult, with straight shoulders and stiff words. But the cold learned his hours and arrived before him, as though it had read his ledgers and knew his roots. It lingered by the stair rail, where the widow had gripped it during her last climb, and it sat on the 7th step where the sailor's child had once slept while his mother scrubbed the floor. It remembered what he preferred to forget. Among the tenants, the rumor turned to shape. They began to say the house was counting, that it had kept its own book all along, and had grown impatient with the neat lies of his ink. They spoke of a light that moved like a breath. They spoke of a door that never stayed latched. They spoke of soft steps at midnight that paused outside the rooms of those most afraid and then moved on, as if fear itself had paid the fee for one more night of sleep. Hargrove called them simple. Yet he did not step on the 7th stair anymore. He did not tear down the feather charm. A child had hung on the banister for luck. He left the charm there and told himself he had not noticed it. When morning came, he found the charm tucked in his drawer beside the key to the ledger cabinet. He put it back on the banister. He did not touch it again. He began to misplace things he had never misplaced. A brass ruler vanished. A rent note reappeared with the figure cut in half, the ink fading as if light had been rubbed through it. He scolded his own memory. He scolded the caretaker. He spoke into rooms with no one in them. He said, "Enough." The rooms did not answer. The answer came another way. The maid went into the parlor 2 days later and found wax everywhere. Not the soft little spills of a reading night. Not the neat drops of prayer. This was a flood. It had pooled under the chair and stiffened along the baseboards in scalloped waves, as if an ocean of candle had rolled and set. She stood in it and felt it crackle under her soles like frozen foam. On the floor, just beyond the edge of the rug, the wax went thin. In that thinness the boards had darkened into a shape. The maid bent close and put her hand over her mouth. It was a footprint. Not the blunt stamp of his heavy shoe. Not the careful oval of the caretaker's boot. It was naked and small, the arch a pale scorch, the toes delicate, as if pressed down from the other side of breath. She went to fetch Hargrove, but when she led him back, the wax had clouded, as though a breath had passed across it, and the print had softened into doubt. He stood a long time, one hand behind his back, the other on the desk, as if choosing which way to lean. He said nothing. His silence was a kind of bargain with the room. That night the wind carried salt into the curtains. The city beyond was a hush of wheels and hooves and distant bells. He locked his study. He pushed the key deep in his pocket and kept his fingers around it until they tingled. He could feel the tooth of the metal. He could feel the fact of it. He told himself that facts were the cure. He sat and watched the candle on his desk because he would not give it the pleasure of lighting it. It lit itself anyway. One moment the wick was a dark thread. The next it bloomed. No scratch of match. No hiss. It simply chose to be fire. He flinched not much, the way a proud man flinches. The flame burned low and unwavering, blue at its throat, gold at its crown, a modest king. It threw a thin coin of light across the ledger, and in that coin he saw a page that was not his. The ink was brown, not black. The hand was ragged, not exact. The letters leaned as if pushed by grief. A name he recognized had been written there, and beside it, in a shaky line, the word paid. There was no sum. There was no date. Only that one small mercy, written as if in the tremor of a last hour. He reached for the page and found only his own crisp line where he had raised the rent that winter. But the echo of the other line remained in his mind the way a bell's note remains after the bell is still. Something began to wear him down. Not sorrow. Not yet. It was the slow abrasion of being watched by a light he could not snuff. He felt, for the first time, the poverty of his certainty. He felt how thin a man becomes when he believes only in things that can be folded and counted. He walked to the window. The city breathed below low roofs, stray smoke, late steps. He rested his forehead against the cold glass and let his breath fog a circle. In the fog, he wrote a figure with his fingertip as children do, an old habit he had not allowed himself since boyhood. When the fog cleared, the figure stayed on the pane in a smear of wax. He bit the inside of his cheek and tasted iron. Somewhere down the hall, a door gave a soft knock, the kind of knock a visitor makes in a house that does not welcome visitors. He waited for the caretaker to rise, for the maid to cross herself, for someone else to meet it. The knock came again. His candle did not flicker. He set his jaw, went to the door, and listened. On the other side, silence held its breath like a person hiding a secret behind their teeth. He did not open it. He walked back to the desk, because that is where his life lived. The flame watched him. He put his hand above it and waited for pain that did not come. And when he drew his hand away, his palm bore a shine as if kissed by soft wax. He sat. He straightened the ledger. He lined the pen along the edge as he always did, a soldier reset in the ranks. He stared at the page and saw nothing on it but a blank, white shore he could not step onto. Downstairs a cradle rocked once and then stopped by itself. A string of beads broke in a drawer he had not opened. The house had grown colder in a new way, a clean cold, the cold of a church before anyone arrives, the cold of truth before a voice names it. He closed the ledger. He folded his hands. He told the room what he had always told it, that debts have due dates and kindness does not. The room disagreed. The candle kept burning, bright, steady, and mocking, as if it knew how every story ends when a man confuses power with peace. And if the living could not make him understand, the question that pressed against his locked door seemed willing to wait. What debt was being paid each night that no coin could cover, and who, exactly, was? It began with smoke, faint and sour, curling up from the spine of a ledger left too close to the flame. The kind of smoke that doesn't rise in warning, but drifts like memory slow, reluctant, unwilling to leave. It hung in Hargrove's study for days after, seeping into the curtains, the floorboards, the folds of his coats. To those who came near the door, it smelled of wax and iron, the scent of something once pure, now scorched beyond forgiveness. The truth never arrived in full light. It came the way dawn comes through sooted glass week, gray, uncertain of its welcome. The story of the widow's son reached the tenants first, carried in whispers between laundry lines and over stair rails. He'd been a dock worker, strong, young, and kind to his mother. He had died in the fire that gutted one of Hargrove's own buildings by the harbor, a place so poorly kept that even the inspectors called it a death trap. The timbers had gone up in minutes. The screams had lasted longer. When the widow came to Hargrove's office, her hands black with soot and grief, she begged him for mercy. Just 1 month to pay. 1 month to bury her son with dignity. He denied her. "I can't house the dead," he told her, closing his ledger as though closing the matter itself. She had looked at him a long time before she left, as if trying to memorize the face of a man who had just sold her last piece of peace. He did not forget that look, though he pretended to. In the weeks after her passing, Hargrove began to notice small things he could not explain. A faint outline of a handprint in the dust near the parlor door. A shape in the window glass that matched the curve of a woman's shoulder. The faint echo of a match being struck, though no one was near the hearth. When he entered his study, the air felt occupied. The candle, the same one she had once kept, appeared there, as if it had walked on its own. He didn't believe it at first. He had ordered it removed from her room, thrown out like everything else that reminded him of her. Yet here it was, the same brass holder, the same tiny nick near the base where the widow's husband had once carved his initials. He stood over it and sneered. "Superstition," he said. "Sentiment." He blew it out and left. When he returned, the wick was burning again. He moved it to another table. The next morning it stood on his desk. Wax pooled over his figures, hardening around his numbers like ice. He scraped it off, but the marks bled through lines warped and unreadable, as though the candle had tried to erase what he had written. That night he heard something from the corridor, a slow, dragging sound, like cloth brushing against wood. He waited. It stopped. The next morning the maid found bits of ash on the stairs, leading up to his door. Inside, the ledger had been opened to a page from years before. The name of the widow's son was there, his debt circled twice in black ink. But next to it, someone had written a single word in the margin. Paid. The ink was brown, old. Hargrove touched it and felt warmth beneath his fingertips, as if the word had just been written. He closed the book, locked it, and tried to laugh. But laughter, once easy for him, now broke into pieces before it reached his lips. He began to stay up through the night, pacing the room, feeding his fire too often, burning pages when the words blurred into shapes he didn't remember writing. Once, the caretaker heard him muttering to himself. Apologies, soft and slurred, like someone confessing in their sleep. "It wasn't my hand," he whispered. "It was just the ink." But the ink, it seemed, had learned to speak for him. The smell of burnt paper drifted down the stairwell. Tenants pressed rags to the cracks in their doors, not for fear of fire, but because the smoke carried words. They said it sounded like someone reciting names. Not one name, many. Names of those long dead, those who had lived in his buildings, worked his docks, owed him money, and lost more than coin. His nights grew longer. The ledger pages grew lighter, their weight eaten by ash. He wrote less and burned more. Once, the maid glimpsed him on his knees before the fireplace, a torn page in his hand, his face lit only by the flame. She heard him say it then clear, trembling, honest. "I didn't know. I didn't know they still counted the dead." His eyes were red, not from smoke, but from seeing something he could not reason away. He tore out another page, then another, feeding the fire as if it were an altar. The candle on the desk never flickered. It burned calm, steady, as if pleased by his repentance, but unwilling to grant him peace. The light stayed even when he slept, its shadowless glow crawling across his books, touching every line he had ever written. The servants refused to enter after dusk. They said the windows glowed from inside with a color no ordinary flame made. One swore he saw faces in the soot-faint, fragile, like portraits painted in smoke. They looked at peace, not vengeful, as if their justice had already been done. But the piece wasn't for Hargrove. His hands began to tremble. His pen cut through paper as though the pages had turned brittle overnight. When he reached for a blank sheet, he found it covered in faint gray prince finger marks, small and delicate, as though a woman had traced the margins while waiting for him to finish. He stopped writing. He sat there, still for hours, until dawn slid pale light through the blinds. The light fell across his desk, across the open book, across his fingers blackened from the ash of what he had burned. In the gray stillness, he thought he saw movement, a shadow rising behind him, shaped like the widow's silhouette, her candle cradled in her hands. He turned too fast, and a chair cracked beneath him. The air shifted. The candle's flame bent toward him, as if bowing in judgment. He tried to speak, but the room swallowed his voice. The only sound left was the quiet drip of melting wax landing on paper. It fell slow and deliberate, dotting the page where numbers had been, covering them one by one. When the wax cooled, it sealed the debts forever. In the days that followed, no one saw Hargrove outside his room. The caretaker brought food. It was left untouched. At night, faint light trembled under the door. The house settled into uneasy silence. On the 5th morning, the maid climbed the stairs and found the handle cold to the touch. She knocked. No answer. The caretaker forced the lock. Inside, the air was still and heavy, thick with the scent of burned books. The ledgers lay in a pile of ash on the desk, the covers warped, the pages curled inward like fists. In the center of it all, one candle remained upright, the same brass holder, the same nick at its base. The wax had burned halfway down, but the flame was steady, unblinking. The chair was empty. Hargrove was gone. Only the imprint of his hand remained on the desktop, pressed into the ash, fingers spread as though in surrender. The caretaker crossed himself. The maid whispered a prayer she half remembered from her mother. The candle didn't move. It watched. They left the room and locked the door behind them. That night, tenants said they saw a faint light behind the curtains, the same golden flicker that had haunted the house for weeks. Some said it was his soul, trying to write one final line. Others said it was the widow's mercy, granting him just enough light to see what he'd done. By the time morning came, the glow was gone. The room smelled of cold wax and smoke. In the ashes on the desk, the caretaker found a scrap of paper that hadn't burned. The writing was faint, written in shaking hand. "The rent is paid." He folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer, and never spoke of it again. But sometimes, when the fog rolled through the harbor and the bells tolled low over the city, the light could be seen again, a brief pulse from a window that no longer existed, a reminder that the dead do not count by coin, but by conscience. And some debts are collected not in life, but in the silence that follows it. They buried him without ceremony. The city had little use for men like Hargrove once they stopped collecting. The undertaker said the body was cold as stone, but the palms were soft, as though the man had been holding something warm when he died. No priest agreed to the prayer. The church refused his name on account of unpaid alms and unrepented cruelty. So they laid him in the frozen ground behind the old cemetery wall, where the earth was shallow and the graves grew wild with moss. The caretaker who'd once feared him said a few quiet words, not for the man, but for the silence that followed him. The wind did the rest. It whistled through the weeds, lifting dust from the ledger pages that had not burned. Somewhere, a bell tolled twice, and then stopped. The house he left behind became an echo of itself. Tenants left one after another, unwilling to sleep where whispers gathered behind the walls. The doors swelled shut, the wallpaper peeled, and dust settled like a second skin over everything he owned. The study remained locked, but every so often, a child walking home from school swore they saw light through the window, a thin, trembling glow, the kind a candle makes when it's almost gone, but refuses to surrender. Mothers hushed them, said it was the moon, but none dared walk close after sunset. By winter, the roof had begun to sag. The parlor smelled of wax, even when the fireplace stayed cold. It was as if the house had taken one long breath the night Hargrove died and never exhaled. Years slid by. The street changed. The dockyards grew louder, the trolleys faster, the people harder. Austin forgot the house in its hunger to move forward. Yet it remained, standing crooked at the corner of its lane, like an old confession no one wanted to reread. The windows clouded from the inside, and ivy crawled up the bricks until the whole thing looked strangled by time. But on certain nights, when fog pressed in from the harbor and the city's noise fell away, a faint amber light could still be seen through the curtains. Some said it flickered like breath against glass. Others swore it stayed steady, patient, unblinking. One worker from the tram yard claimed he saw a silhouette by the window, a man bent over a desk, a candle beside him, his hand frozen mid-right. He said the flame didn't move, not even when the wind cut down the street like a blade. They told him it was imagination. He didn't argue. He just stopped walking that way after dark. In 1920, the house was condemned. The new investors wanted to build something modern, brick, electric, clean. They tore it down in spring. The workers didn't last long. One by one, they asked to be reassigned. They said the ground smoked in the mornings, that the stones held heat like skin. The foreman laughed until he touched one of the foundation blocks himself and drew back as if burned. "Still warm," he muttered, rubbing his hand. After 15 winters. When the rubble was cleared, they found fragments among the ashes. A warped brass candlestick. A key melted into a hinge. A strip of paper fused to a piece of oak illegible, except for one word, written in a trembling hand. Paid. A city. Historian catalogued the artifacts and filed them away in the archives. Most of the records from that neighborhood never survived. Floods, mold, neglect. But one metal piece remained, sealed in a drawer for decades. A piece of that same candlestick, darkened and bent, its base etched with a phrase so small you'd miss it unless the light hit just right. "The rent is paid?" No one could agree whether it had been carved before or after his death. Some said he'd done it himself, an act of guilt in his final hour. Others said the words had always been there, waiting to be revealed by fire. The museum labeled it simply Candle Holder, Boston Tenement, circa 1906. But to those who knew the story, those who had heard their grandparents whisper about the landlord who mocked the dead, it was something more, a reminder, a warning that cruelty never burns clean, and that some fires, once lit, refuse to die. The new building went up fast. Shiny glass, electric lamps, a lobby that smelled of new varnish and ambition. No one spoke of what lay beneath. Yet even then, workers swore the basement stayed warm no matter the season. At night, when the janitor closed up, he sometimes heard a soft hiss near the boiler room, like a candle being snuffed and reignited. Once, when he followed the sound, he found a single patch of melted wax near the floor drain. He cleaned it up. The next morning, it was there again. He never told his supervisor. Some truths aren't worth explaining. Decades passed. The building changed hands, then names. Records blurred. But the stories stayed. The tenants still complained of faint light beneath the floorboards, of shadows that stretched against logic, of a smell of smoke and salt that came and went with no fire in sight. They said the air felt heavy near the walls, like the breath of something that hadn't yet learned to rest. And when storms rolled in from the harbor, lightning sometimes caught on the windows, just right illuminating. For an instant, a figure bent in the old place where Hargrove's study once stood. Always the same shape, always the same stillness. Those who saw it said the light didn't flicker. It burned with purpose. The city never cared. Boston built over its own ghosts, like it always did, paving memory with progress. But in the archives, beneath stacks of forgotten rent ledgers and court orders, that small candlestick fragment remained. The brass had darkened almost black, the engraving barely visible. Yet if you held it to the lamp, the letters shimmered faintly, as though heat still lingered beneath the metal skin. The rent is paid? A curator once dropped it while cataloging. When she picked it up, she swore it felt warm in her hand. She laughed it off, though her voice trembled when she said it. It shouldn't have been warm, not after all those years. There are those who say that the dead forgive more easily than the living. That justice, once done, fades with time. But not all debts are settled by earth. Some are carried in the air, in the weight of a name, in the memory of a single cruel laugh. The light that burned for the widow, the one that followed him to his end, had not been vengeance. It had been a mirror showing him what he was, what he'd taken, what could never be repaid. And when it finished its work, it stayed behind, marking the place where arrogance learned its cost. No priest could bless him, but time did what the church could not. It folded his story into silence, into ash, into the quiet moral that lingers beneath the city's noise. Somewhere, in a narrow street long since renamed, the ground still holds a trace of warmth on cold nights. Passers-by don't notice, not really. But if they stop long enough, they might feel it a pulse through the stone, faint and steady, like the echo of a candle refusing to go out. It is said that light travels farther than sound. Perhaps that's why his name, the one burned away from every record, still flickers faintly beside hers. Together, they remain one who mocked, one who endured. A pair bound not by love or life, but by the balance of truth. The flame was never about punishment. It was memory refusing to fade. And as long as it burns, however faint, the story of the landlord and the widow will not vanish. Because some fires cannot be buried. Some debts refuse to rest. And some names only find peace when the truth is